Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to try to get to the bottom of something that's been, I think, a very controversial topic for decades now.
Mm-hmm.
The Yemenite children affair in Israel.
Yes.
You know, this is, we have a listener question actually about this, and it's so interesting.
Great.
They're interested in how the release of over 300,000 archival documents back in 2016
Wow.
impacted online conversations about it, especially on Facebook. And I think it's just such a fascinating
Yeah.
case blending history and mystery and, the power of online narratives.
It is fascinating.
Yeah.
We've got this decades-old story. During the mass immigration to Israel in the early 1950s, many Yemenite children sadly died or went missing in transit camps.
Right.
And this sparked rumors that still circulate today that these children were systematically kidnapped and given up for adoption, often to European families.
Right. And this kidnapping theory has become so ingrained for a lot of people, particularly within the Yemenite community,
Right.
fueling distrust in the government and leading to numerous official investigations.
Exactly.
But then 2016 rolls around, and this massive trove of archival documents is released, aiming to shed light on what really happened.
Right. You would think in this age of instant information, having access to all that raw data would lead to a more informed and maybe even unified public opinion.
Right.
Early theorists of public discourse like Habermas and Arson certainly thought so.
Yeah.
They believed that shared facts would naturally lead to rational consensus.
That makes sense on the surface, but something tells me it wasn't quite that simple.
You're absolutely right. The research paper you sent me actually dives deep into this.
Okay.
And the findings challenge that assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the evidence debunking the kidnapping theory, online discourse on Facebook largely remained unchanged.
Really?
People continued to believe what they already believe.
Wow, so even with all that evidence readily available,
Yeah.
people's minds weren't really swayed.
Yeah.
That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it speaks to the power of what we call rational ignorance and cognitive dissonance. It sounds complicated, but really it's just about how we as humans process information. Sometimes we choose to ignore information, even if it's true, if it's too difficult or uncomfortable to deal with.
So if someone's deeply convinced of the kidnapping theory, encountering evidence to the contrary might create so much mental discomfort that they just kind of avoid it.
Exactly. It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Right.
The information doesn't fit their existing framework, so they either reject it or twist it to confirm what they already believe. This is where that cognitive dissonance comes into play.
Yes.
That mental discomfort pushes us to protect our existing beliefs.
And the internet, with all its echo chambers and filter bubbles, probably amplifies this, right?
Absolutely. Think of it this way. If you're already predisposed to believe in the kidnapping theory, you're more likely to seek out and engage with information that supports that belief, even if it's on Facebook or in online forums.
So you end up in these online communities where everyone's reinforcing each other's beliefs, regardless of what the actual evidence says.
Exactly.
That makes the findings of the paper even more intriguing. It wasn't just individuals clinging to their beliefs.
Right.
Different types of Facebook pages like media outlets, politicians, NGOs, and public interest groups also showed interesting patterns.
You're right. The paper breaks down how these groups engaged with the archival information, and it gets really fascinating.
Okay.
Traditional media and politicians, while not necessarily unbiased, did show slightly more engagement with the archives compared to NGOs and public interest groups.
Okay, so there's a difference in how these groups approach the information. Can we dive into some specific examples from the paper to illustrate this?
Yeah.
I'm really curious to see how it all played out.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Absolutely. Let's look at a post from Channel 13 News in Israel,
Okay.
a popular page with a broad reach.
Okay.
They promoted a report by saying, forget everything you knew about the Yemenite children affair, the facts versus the myths who are interested in lying to you. The source takes a deep dive into the archives.
So they're framing it as like a quest for truth, right?
Yeah.
Positioning the archives as this source of clarity.
Exactly.
Almost like they're playing the role of the investigator, helping the public sift through all the information.
Exactly. But then you have a post by the NGO AMRAM, which is dedicated to this very issue.
Okay.
Their post reads, "This Sunday, as every year, there will be an awareness day for the abduction of children from Yemen and the Balkans. The upcoming Awareness Day will be marked by a demand that WIZO take responsibility for its part in the affair."
Wow, so that's a stark contrast, right?
Yeah.
The NGO is using much stronger language.
Right.
Abduction, demand for responsibility. It feels less about the archives themselves and more about reinforcing this pre-existing narrative of wrongdoing.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It really highlights how even with access to the same information, different groups will interpret and frame it to support their own narratives and agendas.
And that makes me think about the media's role in all of this. You mentioned earlier that they often framed the release of the archives as this quest for truth, but did that actually play out in their coverage?
It's a mixed bag, to be honest. While some outlets did take a more neutral investigative approach,
Yeah.
others continued to use the language of the kidnapping theory even when the evidence didn't necessarily support it.
Really?
For example, the paper cites a post from Channel 12 News in Israel, another popular outlet.
Mm-hmm.
The post says, Rina Matzliak has put the affair of the kidnapped Yemenite children back on the agenda, and in a special column, she calls to put an end to the affair and to treat this wound at its source.
Okay, so even while promoting a discussion about the archives, they're using that emotionally charged word, kidnapped.
Right.
It almost feels like they're perpetuating the very narrative that's being contested.
And it goes even further later in that same post. The reporter Rina Matzliak is quoted as saying, "In the last 2 months that I've been dealing with the affair of kidnapped Yemenite children, and I deliberately say abducted, I don't just mean lost children because these children were kidnapped from their mother's arms."
Wow, she's not mincing words there.
No.
It seems like some media outlets might be prioritizing sensationalism and audience engagement over a nuanced examination of the evidence.
Right.
I wonder if that's part of why these beliefs persist, even with access to so much information.
It's certainly a factor, and it underscores how the media, even with good intentions, can sometimes contribute to the spread of misinformation or the reinforcement of harmful narratives.
Right.
It's a reminder that we need to be critical consumers of information, even from sources we generally trust.
It's true. You know, this whole case feels like a microcosm of what we're seeing in the digital age more broadly.
Yes.
The rise of misinformation, the blurring lines between truth and falsehood, and the persistence of conspiracy theories.
Absolutely. And this research on the Yemenite children affair offers some really valuable insights into these challenges. It suggests that access to raw information alone isn't enough to change deeply held beliefs, and it raises some big questions about how we combat misinformation and foster more reasoned public discourse.
It makes you realize that we can't simply rely on algorithms or fact-checking websites to solve this problem.
Right.
It requires a more fundamental shift in how we approach information, engage with different perspectives, and build trust in a world where truth itself feels increasingly fragmented.
I couldn't agree more. We need to develop critical thinking skills, recognize our own biases, and be willing to engage in respectful dialogue even when it's difficult.
And this is where the internet, despite its reputation for division and polarization, can also offer opportunities for connection and understanding.
Right.
We have access to diverse perspectives, voices from marginalized communities, and experts who can help us make sense of complex information.
It's about creating spaces for genuine dialogue, where respectful disagreement is welcomed and nuanced exploration of challenging topics is encouraged. We need to move beyond the echo chambers and recognize that truth is often messy, multifaceted, and elusive.
So where does this leave us with the Yemenite children affair?
Yeah.
If the release of the archives didn't provide the definitive answers that people were hoping for,
Right.
where do we go from here?
That's a great question. The paper primarily focuses on the impact of the archives on online discourse, but it doesn't delve into the broader implications for truth reconciliation or healing.
Right.
I'm particularly curious about the reactions within the Yemenite community itself. I imagine there's a wide spectrum of perspectives on the archival evidence and its implications.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract academic debate.
Yeah.
There are real people, real families who've been deeply impacted by this tragedy, and their voices need to be centered and respected.
Precisely. And that speaks to the limitations of a purely data-driven approach we need to combine rigorous research with empathy, understanding, and a willingness to listen to lived experiences.
We have to acknowledge that truth isn't always a simple yes or no, black or white concept.
Right.
It can be complex, nuanced, and open to multiple interpretations.
Especially in cases like this where emotions run high and the stakes are so personal.
Yeah.
The pursuit of truth requires sensitivity, compassion, and a commitment to open dialogue. It's not just about finding answers. It's about acknowledging the pain, the loss, and the ongoing search for meaning and justice.
It's a reminder that history isn't just a collection of facts and dates. It's a living narrative that continues to shape our present and future.
And in this digital age where information flows so freely and narratives can be easily manipulated, it's crucial to approach history with a critical eye, an open mind, and a compassionate heart.
Beautifully said. This has been a really insightful exploration.
Oh.
But before we wrap up our deep dive, I'm curious, what are your final thoughts for our listener? You know, it's incredible how much we've unpacked about this case.
Yeah.
We've gone from the historical context of the Yemenite children affair to how the release of these archives really shook things up online. It makes you think about how we process information, especially when it comes to something as emotionally charged as this.
It really does. And for me, one of the biggest takeaways is that information, even when it's readily available, doesn't always lead to the outcomes we might expect. Releasing those archival documents was undoubtedly a crucial step toward transparency,
Right.
but it didn't magically resolve the debate or bridge the divides that surround this issue.
It seems like the information itself almost became another layer of complexity,
Right.
another battleground for competing narratives and interpretations.
That's a great way to put it, and it brings up a question that I've been pondering. Could the way the information was presented have influenced its impact? What if instead of releasing hundreds of thousands of raw documents online, there was a more curated, fact-checked, multi-perspective presentation of the archives?
That's a really interesting thought. It's like
Yeah.
difference between giving someone a box of puzzle pieces versus giving them the picture on the box to guide them.
Exactly.
A more curated approach might have provided more context, highlighted key findings, and maybe even fostered a more constructive dialogue.
Exactly. It could have helped bridge the gap between the raw data and the public's understanding of it. Instead of being overwhelmed by this sea of information, people might have had a clearer framework for navigating the complexities of this issue.
It makes you wonder if releasing the archives in such a raw, unmediated format might have inadvertently fueled the flames of those existing conspiracy theories.
Right.
Without that clear narrative or guidance, it seems more likely that people would just fill in the blanks with their pre-existing beliefs.
It's a valid point, and it highlights the responsibility that comes with sharing information, especially when we're dealing with sensitive and emotionally charged topics like this.
Yeah.
Transparency is crucial, but it's not just about making information available. It's about providing the context and the tools that people need to engage with it meaningfully.
This has really made me reflect on how I approach information in my own life. It's easy to get caught in those echo chambers we talked about, surrounded by people who share my views and quick to dismiss anything that challenges my beliefs.
That's a natural human tendency, but it's important to remember that our beliefs shouldn't be static. They should evolve as we encounter new information and perspectives. The key is to approach information with curiosity, not defensiveness. Ask questions, challenge your own assumptions, and be open to respectful dialogue, even when it's with someone who sees the world differently.
That's great advice. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Yemenite children affair, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
I think it boils down to this information is incredibly powerful, but it's not a magic solution. It can illuminate, but it can also obscure, it can unite, but it can also divide the way we choose to engage with information, the questions we ask, the perspectives we seek out. Those are the real game changers. So the next time you come across a complex issue or a piece of information that challenges your beliefs, take a pause, reflect, and ask yourself, what am I missing? What other viewpoints are out there? And how can I engage with this information in a way that is both critical and compassionate?
What a powerful way to put it. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be active, engaged, and discerning citizens in this age of information overload. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time for another insightful exploration.